I want to thank Professor Greene for joining us. Dr. Maggie Greene is Assistant Professor of History. She teaches modern Chinese history and East Asian cultural history at Montana State University. She teaches a number of courses there, and her most recent book is Resisting Spirits, Drama, Reform, and Cultural Transformation in the People's Republic of China from the University of Michigan Press. Her doctorate is from the University of California, San Diego. And Professor Greene is a former classmate of mine. It's a great privilege, it's a great delight to welcome Dr. Greene to speak with us today. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor Greene.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's a little weird to be giving my first book talk on Zoom, but also a little exciting. At least we can do something. As Dr. Ray mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about my book, which was published last August, so Resisting Spirits. And as fun as I thought it would be for you guys to just hear a straight A to Z discussion of what the book is all about, I'm actually figured it would be nice to kind of walk you through some of exactly what the book is looking at and some of my sources and methodology and some of the main stories in it. If you're looking for an engaging read that's relatively short, it sort of fits the bill. As the subtitle says, this is a book about drama reform and cultural transformation in the People's Republic of China. And most of my work is really focused on the 1950s and the 1960s, the high socialist period. So really the bulk of the book covers the years between 1950 and 1966 with the start of the Cultural Revolution. Drama is actually a really interesting thing to look at when thinking about cultural history in China, partially because it's this really sort of broad and enormous category of all sorts of works. But in this work in particular, I actually look at one of the most celebrated genres of Chinese literature and Chinese theater, which is actually the ghost opera. And I want to talk a little bit about just what ghost opera is. I first started this project back in 2009, a very long-seeming time ago, wanting to look at one of the most famous ghost operas and its sort of post-Mao career, and that would be the Peony Pavilion. And for a variety of reasons, that was not going to work out. And I sort of wound up looking at a couple of products from the 1950s and 1960s. And at the time, it really surprised me that ghosts were all over the place in Chinese literature and in Chinese theater, because it's sort of not what we tend to think of, I think, when we think of socialist, Chinese socialist cultural production, right, in the 1950s and 60s. We're sort of much more likely to think of model operas or ballerinas with bayonets, women in these long ghostly costumes telling stories that happened theoretically, 1,000 years ago. Doesn't seem very communist in a lot of ways, but they were actually all over China in the 50s and 60s, and were actually really important politically and also culturally. So what is a ghost opera? The first thing is that it always falls into the category of traditional Chinese theater, which is different than spoken language drama, huaju, or Western style opera, guoju. Ghost operas are always set in usually the pretty far distant past. In my case, the plays that I study are all set in the late 13th century, so the late Song dynasty. They all have a plot point that revolves around somebody dying and coming back as a ghost, hence the name ghost opera. And they can be tragedies, they can be romances, they can be romantic comedies, they can be romantic tragedies. In the case of the play that I study, it's very much a sort of romantic tragedy in a lot of ways, but they all feature the return of one of the main characters as a ghost. And in addition to looking at debates over ghost opera, I sort of consider what I call supernatural literature more broadly. So this is everything that isn't a play, but there's a lot of really famous literary compendia, for instance, from the imperial period, with some of the finest works of imperial era literature that all involve stories of the supernatural. And these can be everything from fox spirits to ghosts to, pick something, if it's got a supernatural element to it. And as I'll discuss, these are actually really problematic products for a lot of cultural workers in the PRC, because on the one hand, they're very celebrated pieces of literature. In many cases, they're very famous, very beloved, very widespread. But in other cases, they don't necessarily seem to be the sorts of things that communists will be promulgating over time. So this is actually one reason that I decided to focus on ghost opera and the debates on supernatural literatures. First of all, they're all over the place in the 50s and 60s. Second, they actually wind up playing a really important role in several key political moments, particularly the lead up to the Cultural Revolution. And third, they just really give you a good sense of a lot of the pressures that cultural workers were operating under in the 1950s and 1960s, in this really fraught political period where there's a lot going on. A colleague of mine who's an Americanist, who I love very much, but just once said to me, "I can't believe your book only covers like 15 years. And I said, well, it was sort of a really packed period of Chinese history. In particular, I look at 3 different versions of, that's all based on the same source material. And what this allows me to do is look at different versions of the same story at different moments, at different key political moments, and figure out what's going on with these adaptations, what's going on with their reception, both culturally and politically. How are they related? How are they really different? And what do they signal about these different periods that they're in? So the character that I really focus on, and who's actually on the cover of the book, is named Huiniang, and she has a really long and storied career. Oh, I just realized the sidebar is probably covering all that up. My apologies. I'm not super with Zoom. So Huiniang's literary pedigree actually stretches back to the 14th century, the late 14th century, the very early Ming dynasty, when a guy named Chao writes a collection of strange tales that are called New Tales Told by Lamplight. And she makes her first nameless appearance, but it's her first real literary appearance in a time that's actually pretty chaotic and rather crisis-ridden, which, as we will see, is a sort of theme with ghosts in Chinese literary and political history. So part of his collection is a short story called The Woman in Greene, Wu Yuan, which tells a tale of romance, mistaken identity, and this sort of ghostly love affair. Her career really takes off, though, in the Ming Dynasty, in the late Ming Dynasty, when Zhou Chaojun writes this big 44-act play called The Story of Red Plums. And this tells the story of a woman named Li Huiniang, who was a concubine in the household of Jia Sidao, who was the prime minister towards the end of the Song Dynasty, when things are really going quite badly. And Jia Sidao was a real historical personage. If you go back and read the dynastic histories, he kind of goes down as one of the big baddies of the Southern Song. There's this perception of him both in terms of the history and how he appears in popular culture, like the story of Red Plums, that he really didn't care about what was happening to the country. He was just much more concerned about his own pleasure and maintaining his own position. And indeed, this is the kind of person he comes off in many of these plays. So one night, Jia Sidao, Li Huiniang, and the rest of his retinue are on West Lake, Hangzhou's West Lake, having fun, and they run into 3 students, young students, who are very, very, very angry about Jia Sidao's action or inaction, as the case may be. And one of the students stands up and gives this very impassioned speech, basically castigating Jia Sidao for being a really bad prime minister. And Li Huiniang catches sight of this young man and murmurs just a very brief admiring comment. She just says, "Oh, what a handsome youth." And when they get back to Jia Sidao's compound, he has overheard her say this. So in a fit of rage, he has her murdered. And because of her love for this young student, which is really quite instantaneous, she winds up not really being able to slough off her mortal coils, so she returns as a ghost. And indeed, she winds up protecting Jia Sidao, or protecting Pei Yu, this young student, from Jia Sidao's wrath. It's a really big, sprawling story. There's all sorts of plots and subplots tied up into that, but the story itself of Li Huiniang has actually proved really, really compelling over the centuries. So she shows up in all sorts of different theatrical repertoires. She shows up in many different guises. Most of the plays were performed under the name Red Plum Pavilion or The Story of Red Plums. But by the 20th century, she's very much entrenched into Chinese cultural history. So the focus of my book isn't on this sort of early history, it's on these two really important adaptations that she received in the 1950s and the 1960s. So the first was a play that I'll talk more about, Ma Jianling's Wandering Westlake, which has the dubious distinction of being one of the only ghostless ghost plays I've ever read. And then the play that actually started my entire examination of this subject, and that's Meng Chao's 1961 Huiniang. I also look a little bit at a version that came out in 1980 after the end of the Cultural Revolution, during reform and opening up. But the real heart of my narrative revolves around Ma Jianling's version, and then in particular, Meng Chao's version. So I wanted to walk you guys a little bit through some of the kinds of sources that I use, because I've got a kind of interesting mix in some respects. Obviously, I have plays themselves. In many cases, I own a number of, actually pretty rare practice editions. So this one that you can see on the left is an original practice edition of the 1961 production of Li Huiniang. Got a number of those. I've got a number of book publications. So while I'm not really a literary scholar in many respects, I do spend time, digging into, okay, what was the actual product? What was actually written in these plays? Probably more important are sources like you can see on the right. This is just a review article from Theater Report, which is a really major, important theater-related magazine in the PRC. So I'm looking and tracking a lot of debates and discussion as they appear in journals, as they appear in newspapers, and the like. However, I do also use a number of archival documents, because one thing that I like to be really clear about, because something that when you study performance arts, people always want to know, well, what did people actually think of whatever it was that they were watching? And I know that studying sort of the text, right, stuff like this practice edition, or things that you find in journals and newspapers doesn't necessarily reflect real practice, and it certainly doesn't reflect sort of what audiences were experiencing. And while that's not sort of the main goal of my work, the main goal is really to think about how are cultural workers really dealing with this incredibly complex political and cultural environment. It is also nice to sort of get some understanding of what was going on from a kind of bird's eye bureaucratic view. So I did all my research in Shanghai, in the Shanghai Municipal Archives between 2010 and 2011. The SMA have historically been one of the most open archives, if not the most open, in China, and they have thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pages related to drama reform and what was going on in the Shanghainese theater world in the 1950s and the 1960s. So I'm really lucky to have an entire giant box full of these things, which I could probably pull 5 more projects out of if I needed to. But I have 2 main kinds of sources that I deal with when looking at this, and they really help not necessarily understand exactly what lived experience was or what lived practice was, but do give a really sort of good overview of trends and changes in the theater world. So I can then look at that compared to, okay, well, what's going on with directives, or how is this interfacing with the kinds of discussions that we see in Theater Report? What does this tell us about the kinds of products that we're looking at? So this is one example. This one's actually from 1957. And this is just straight up, this is a repertoire record. The column on the left tells you what troupe they're looking at, and all the things on the right are various plays or pieces of plays that people are looking at or being performed in that particular year. So this one happens to be related to Peking opera. They've got several different types of opera that are really common in Shanghai. So each different genre of opera, of Chinese opera, gets their own listing. And one thing to note about the fact I mentioned parts of plays, with traditional Chinese opera, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, if you go to the opera, you're not going to see an entire opera. There's a lot of reasons for this, but particularly for some of the kinds of products that I'm looking at, such as ghost opera. I think I mentioned Zhou Chaojun's original is 44 acts long. It's a very long play. When the Peony Pavilion was finally performed in Todo in 1999, it took 3 days of 6 hours straight a day to get through the entire thing. So what you're really going to be seeing is excerpts from different plays over the course of the night, and they may not even be the same play. This is really different than what we see in the case of spoken language drama or the kinds of operas that I'm looking at that were freshly written in the 50s and early 60s and really designed to be performed as one cohesive whole. So again, I've got a lot of these kinds of documents, which are fantastic. You can go through and hunt for whatever you would like. The ones that are actually even more interesting and do tend to change over time, but give a real sense of how the bureaucracy was dealing with cultural production are sources like these, which give actually a big broad overview of those documents that the document type that I just showed you. This is actually, was put together in 1959. This becomes really common after 1958 to start collating all this information they've been collecting for a decade. And in this case, this is again sort of a big bird's eye overview. The left column tells you what genre of opera. So we've got Peking opera and Yeju and Hu opera and then spoken language drama. The next column tells you how many troupes were active. And then the next is actually how many plays were being performed. And then the next category for me is actually one of the most interesting because what that's tracking is how many plays on so-called contemporary themes. So not traditional opera. And as I'll talk about, this is something that the CCP was really concerned about promulgating, were plays on contemporary or revolutionary themes versus things that were taking place in the imperial past. And then the number of traditional, so-called traditional plays, Chuantong. And you can see the column with Chuantong far outpaces the operas on contemporary themes. And this really holds completely consistent until 1965, when, at least in Shanghai, people simply weren't allowed to perform traditional operas anymore. But these give a really good sense of how the bureaucracy is dealing with changes to the repertoire, what sorts of things they think are important, what sorts of things they want to be able to track. So a lot of my book is again really much based on reading of plays, but also journals and newspapers. But I do get to use some pretty cool archival sources, and I'll show you a great example of one a little later in the talk. And the second thing I wanted to mention was just one thing that I'm doing methodologically, which I often say to people sounds like stupidly simple, but is something that isn't super common, at least in for those of us that study PRC history, I think. And that's, I utilize what the literary scholar Sharon Marcus has termed surface reading or just reading. A lot of times in PRC history, we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what documents have not actually been saying, but what we can pull from them from reading between the lines. And a lot of these ghost operas, Meng Chao's in particular, as well as a number of the key debates I look at, have really been discussed in terms of what they were implying, not what they were overtly saying. So that's really symptomatic reading. And I'm very sympathetic to so-called symptomatic reading. I think it is really important, especially in studying places and times like the high socialist period in China, where people couldn't necessarily come out and be completely overt with what they were saying or with their criticisms or critiques, to look for the silences, to look for the spaces. I think it's also, though, really important, and I take very seriously the idea that these people who are so passionately discussing ghost opera and so passionately discussing China's literary inheritance and what to do with this fantastic body of pre-1911 or even pre-1949 literature, they were genuinely and fundamentally interested in that. And so my book is really focused on the so-called surface of the debates, not because I think that the subtext is isn't important, but because we have actually spent a lot of time talking about what people might have been implying, and we have sort of ignored what they were overtly stating. So that's really much my approach, is not necessarily to go hunting for what they might have been implying. And in some cases, such as my first article on Huiniang, I've already discussed what I think the author was implying. In this case, I was much more interested in sort of the surface of everything. So that's a bit on, again, the sort of methodology and my approach and also my sources. Now, who cares about drama reform and why is drama reform important? So the first thing is that cultural reform in the PRC, and actually even earlier, was incredibly, incredibly important. There's a lot of people who recognized in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that if you wanted political reform, if you wanted social reform, that was also going to require cultural reform. So this isn't some discussion that's a sort of nice to have. People are really passionately discussing what to do with drama both before and after 1949, much like they're discussing culture more generally, partially because it's seen as being really, really, really important for political and social reform. The writer Liang Chao in 1902 basically wrote an essay blaming the state of China and everything that has possibly could have gone wrong in China and all the negative aspects of China on fiction, right? So he writes this big essay on the relationship of fiction to the government of the people, saying, if you want to reform the people, you have to reform fiction, you have to reform what they're watching and what they're paying attention to. And drama and traditional Chinese theater was an incredibly effective vehicle in a lot of ways. It was incredibly widespread. Like I mentioned, there was no one kind of Chinese opera. Wherever you were in the country, you would have some specialized, usually local kind of opera. So you've got stuff in a variety of dialects, and all of these things have their own tunes. They've got their own specialties. It's very, very local. It doesn't necessarily require much technology, right? All you really need are some actors and some musicians. You don't need fancy lights. You don't even need electricity. It was something that was very much a part of people's everyday lives, right? So you would go to the temple fair and people would be performing opera. It wasn't just for the elite. So opera is kind of interesting in that case because it crosses a lot of boundaries, both in terms of class, in terms of where you are. So really, beginning in the early 20th century, people started thinking, well, we can really use this to our advantage to try and influence people and to educate people. On the education aspect, it had actually been used for didactic purposes for a very, very long time, but there's sort of a new inflection on it in the early 20th century because people are trying to figure out how to use it to affect political change. And it was actually a priority for the CCP really starting in the 1930s, especially after they moved to Yan'an. If you've ever seen footage or video from Yan'an, you might note that you see a lot of opera performances because they recognize that this is a really great vehicle that can appeal to people who maybe aren't going to be able to sit down and like read, Das Kapital, but they can sit and watch a play on land reform. But this is also going to create tension too, because on the one hand, there's going to be a big emphasis on the creation of new kinds of drama, but then there becomes this question of what do we do with the old stuff? And you can really see part of this tension in Mao's talks, the Yan'an Forum on Art and Literature, and Mao sort of asked the question, well, people say that Marxism destroys creative moods. Does Marxism destroy creative moods? And Mao says, yes, absolutely. It destroys creative moods that are feudal, that are bourgeois, that are liberalistic, that are individualist, nihilist, art for art's sake, and so on and so on. And he says all of these things should be utterly destroyed, and while they're being destroyed, something new can be constructed. So pretty much any imperial era literary product could be slapped with one of these labels quite easily and without too much mental gymnastics. But then he goes on to say, but we have to take on all the fine things in our literary and artistic heritage, and we have to assimilate whatever is beneficial, and we need to use these as examples, and we can't reject them. We can't reject these examples out of hand or refuse to learn from them. So, as early as 1942, this is the tightrope that cultural workers are having to walk. On the one hand, we want to destroy all this bad stuff. On the other hand, we want to save it and learn from it too. So one of the big tensions that I explore in my work is what happens after 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic of China. How do cultural workers, who in many cases were these kind of scrappy radicals, and certainly many of them in the 1920s and 1930s were really radical in terms of their opinions on what needed to be done with traditional Chinese culture, what do they do when they become the bureaucrats? What do they do when they are now tasked with shaping artistic policy and implementing all these varying policies? Because what you see is it's actually this really sort of sad balancing act that they're trying to create in the 1950s and early 1960s. One of the other things that I look at, and this is part of the reason that ghost opera itself turns out to be really useful when considering cultural policy in the 1950s and 60s, is it actually gets us into issues beyond this sort of cultural destruction on the one hand and saving it on the other. It actually gets us into a lot of questions of related to popular religion, popular science, and sort of overall goals of the regime in the 1950s and 60s, and in particular, the focus on stamping out superstition. So oh dear. Go away, no. Part of the reason this becomes really important is because a lot of people, again, this is one reason people say, well, there was ghost opera all over the place in the 1950s and 1960s. I thought they were trying to talk people out of believing in ghosts. Cultural workers draw a really strict line between what they see as superstitious popular practice. So things like praying to spirits, believing in feng shui, you know, burning paper money to the ancestors and so on and so forth, to what they call mythology. So we've got superstitious practice on the one hand, and then we have mythology on the other, which is seen as actually being useful and something that can be used as a didactic tool, but also something that in many cases is really important to sort of Chinese culture broadly, broadly construed. So again, a lot of these really famous stories and folk tales and things like the cowherd and the weaving maid, for any of you that are familiar with that story, become really important flashpoints in this discussion over superstition and mythology. And what I argue is that throughout most of the 1950s and up until 1963, cultural workers actually are really successful in safely creating a space for these products that include things like ghosts and spirits and gods to exist, while successfully cordoning them off from things like that are discussed in these pamphlets from the early 1960s, or actually late 1950s, apologies, that are discussing superstitious practice. But as we'll see, this actually becomes sort of an issue in 1963 when ghost plays are banned entirely. They're partially going to be banned on the basis that the Chinese people are just too impressionable and not yet at a high enough intellectual level overall to be able to watch ghosts and spirits on stage without believing in them. So this is another sort of tension that I tease out in the book. As I mentioned, I look at two main plays. The bulk of the book is really centered around two plays, again, both based on the same source material. So I just wanted to walk you through that a little bit. The first big Huiniang I focus on is actually a play called Wandering Westlake, which was written by a guy named Jianling. And he writes the first version with some help in 1953. And Ma is actually a pretty interesting character. He was from a relatively well-educated but kind of middling family in Shanxi province. And from a really young age, he had displayed a fair amount of ability and talent for working with both just music in general, but Shanxi local forms in particular. And he actually joins the Communist Party in the 1920s. He follows his elder brother, and then eventually actually makes his way to Yan'an, where he sets up a very famous theater troupe. And one historian has described this theater troupe of his as probably the only theater troupe in Yan'an that was actually working with local forms. And so he really made his name writing drama on revolutionary and contemporary themes. So stuff like resisting the Japanese invasion, talking about land reform, and so on and so forth. But by the 1950s, and again, his position is really cemented by then, he decides to turn to working with sort of traditional Chinese products because he believed that there was a lot of good to be found in them, not a lot of bad, but you still had to sort through them. So in 1953, he decides to remake Red Plum Pavilion, and he puts a lot of stuff in that helps resonate with contemporary events like the new marriage law. But he also makes a really interesting decision, which kind of comes back to haunt him like a ghost, and continues showing up year after year after year. And the first time I saw a reference to this play, I didn't actually believe that it existed because it doesn't actually show up in his collected works. And then I found out that the ghostless ghost play did actually exist. So in addition to some of the other plot changes he makes, the really big one is that he makes Li Huiniang not die. And he accomplishes this through some, sleights of hand in the plot, and she dresses up like a ghost. And you can see what he was thinking, right? This play is wonderful, but the problem is that it's potentially, encouraging superstition among the masses. So if you get rid of the ghost, we'll be able to fix the play. And unfortunately for Mao Jianling, despite the fact that this play actually seemed to be very, very, very popular among audiences and among troops, it was absolutely savaged by critics and intellectuals who really came back and hit hard at this idea that ghosts were inherently bad on the stage and should be completely removed. So he actually goes back in 1958 and revises the play. He puts the ghost back into the ghost play. Liu Huiniang dies and comes back as a ghost. And that's actually the version that has been passed down in his collected works. The only reason I ever saw a version of the 1953 one is because I luckily was able to buy a copy on kongfuzi.com, which is the world's best secondhand book website. So I used the Mao Jianling case to illustrate actually the sort of differences between popular anti-superstition campaigns, which again were aimed at things like stamping out superstition among the masses, and what the intellectuals and cultural workers and in many cases cadre were really looking for in terms of their plays. And I look at the ways in which they make the argument that ghosts are okay, theatrical ghosts are okay. And what it really boils down to, really up until 1963, is the argument that ghosts are positive teaching tools, and ghosts like Li Huiniang can teach people how to stand up to great evil. And actually the title of the book comes from a phrase that often gets trotted out in the 1950s and 60s when people are justifying ghosts on didactic merits, and they say that it teaches people to have a 反抗的精神, a resisting spirit or a spirit of resistance. And they argue that if you take the ghost out of the ghost play, you've ruined the emotional intensity, and then you've also ruined the didactic intensity for the play being able to be used. So that was Mao Jianling's sort of, at least initially, ill-fated version. And the next one, and the one that's closest to my heart that I look at, and that really three chapters of the book focus pretty heavily on, is Meng Chao's 1961 play. And Meng Chao was actually from a pretty elite background. He grew up in Jucheng, Shandong, came from a very, very good intellectual bureaucratic family. He was very much steeped in sort of Confucian learning from a young age, but then moved to Shanghai in the 1920s, joined the Chinese Communist Party, also joined a pretty radical literary society. And so he's kind of an interesting figure because he goes from being this really way out there, I mean, and the Sun Society was quite out there, even for leftist literary societies, to then in 1961 coming back and not just writing a ghost play, but writing a ghost play in one of the oldest, most elite forms of Chinese opera, which is kunxu, which, it doesn't matter if we're talking the 16th century or the 1960s, this was the domain of the elite. So his version is really as high flown and really targeted towards the elites as Mao Jianling's was really targeted towards the masses. So if Mao Jianling is asking, can we take the ghost out of the ghost play and still have something satisfying, Meng Chao seems to be asking, how little do we sort of have to do with these traditional literary products to bring them into compliance with dictates on art and literature. Because one thing that frequently gets commented on when people are talking about Meng Chao's version in the early 1960s is how beautiful it is and how beautiful the language is, and how elegant and refined it is. And really, in many cases, I mean, it's beautiful classical Chinese you're reading. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that a good cadre would be writing in 1961, but it was absolutely celebrated in the early 1960s. Meng Chao's version, though, is really, really, really important politically for a couple of reasons. And the first is that it belongs to a type of play called New Historical Plays. And these are plays that were freshly rewritten. They were brand new creations, in many cases produced under pretty heavy political supervision. So for those of you that know your late 1950s, early 1960s Chinese history, you've probably heard of Wuhan's Hairei dismissed from office, and Tianhan's Xie. And these are two of the most important plays, partially because of their ties to the Cultural Revolution, and Meng Chao's version actually belongs with them. These are the three great poisonous weeds of the early Cultural Revolution. Historically, these plays have been read as tacit criticism of the Chinese Communist Party and party policy in the wake of the disastrous Great Leap Forward. And as I mentioned earlier, ghosts tend to reassert themselves in Chinese literary history in times of crisis. So it doesn't seem to be an accident that they come to the fore once again in the early 1960s. I should mention that neither Hairei nor Xie Yaohuan is actually a ghost opera. Li Huiniang is special in that respect. Li Huiniang is also a little special partially because of one of Meng Chao's old relationships. I mentioned that Meng Chao was from Zhucheng, Shandong, and two other really important figures in 1960s politics were actually also from Zhucheng. And the first is Kang Sheng, who you can see here actually writing this calligraphy down for the opening of the Northern Kun Opera Troupe, which is the opera troupe that actually performs Li Huiniang. Kang Sheng is a really inscrutable figure. For those of you that know stuff about the high Chinese politics and the high socialist period, he's this really shadowy figure, and he's often comes off as quite villainous. He and Meng Chao, though, were actually old friends. They moved to Shanghai together, and were both studying at Shanghai Daxue. They eventually drifted apart in the 1930s. Meng Chao is going to spend time running all around China. He's actually not going to be in Yan'an. Kang Sheng is going to go to the Soviet Union. He is going to come back and be at Yan'an. And again, he's going to be this really shadowy sort of figure in the 1950s and 1960s that politically really important. He's not a really good friend to have. If he's your only friend in a high place, you probably don't want it to be Kang Sheng. The other person who was from Zhucheng, Shandong, and who Kang Sheng knew, but Meng Chao did not, was Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. And of course, Kang Sheng and Jiang Qing in the early 1960s are really going to recognize that Mao is increasingly displeased with everything going on. And they're going to notice that maybe this is a sort of political opportunity for them, but they're not going to make their move politically first. They actually really make their move culturally. In 1962, Jiang Qing tries to get Hairei dismissed from office banned. That doesn't work. But in March of 1963, she is successfully going to get ghost opera banned entirely from Chinese stages. The ostensible justification, as I mentioned, is that the Chinese people are simply not at a level ideologically where they can be trusted to watch ghosts on stages and not believe in them. There's another reason, though, and it's that ghost opera, partially because it had been such an object of discussion and such an object of arguments, was actually it was much easier to ban ghost opera. Mao at one point had said that people should act like Hairei. Mao had never said people should act like Li Huiniang. So in some respects, it's sort of low-hanging fruit. And again, Kang Sheng is Meng Chao's only friend in a really, really, really high place, and is not a particularly good friend to have. The ghost opera discussion, though, that takes place in 1963 is actually really interesting, because I think it sort of puts aside some assumptions that we often make about sort of grassroots versus elite culture, and culture in Shanghai, where Jiang Qing and her clique were based, versus Beijing, because once you start getting into the archival documents, you actually notice there's some really interesting stuff going on. And the documents I have relating to this are really interesting because what they actually relate to is a really important discussion that happened in a major newspaper called the Guangming Daily in September of 1963. So this is from September 10th, and this goes on for day after day after day after day. And a lot of the discussion is actually taken up with the ghost play problem. That's what's going on in the piece actually at the bottom of here. So this is really elite stuff. And it would be really, really, really easy to say, well, that's just the elites discussing, and what difference does any of this make to how average everyday people are understanding this stuff? And the answer is it's actually the effect of the Guangming Daily discussion and how that plays out in troops in Shanghai is fascinating. And we have records of troop meetings that took place over the span of many, many days, much of which was dedicated to discussing everything that was in these Guangming Daily debates and in the newspaper, but then also discussing the ghost play problem. And one of the fascinating things about these documents is you really get a sense of how tired cultural workers were of having to deal with these constantly changing directives. In 1958, ghosts are okay. And then in 1961, ghosts are still okay. And then suddenly in 1963, they're not. And there's this real sense of exhaustion and just sort of frustration with everything going on politically and everything that had been going on politically. So you see people actually actively questioning party policy in ways that they wouldn't. And actually, one of my favorite quotes comes from this document, and it's members of an opera troupe who say, this ghost play problem, the Central Committee has already decided it, so what's left to discuss, question mark, exclamation point, which gives you a sense, again, of some of the frustration that people are dealing with. So as I argue in the book, actually the banning of ghost plays should be seen as the earliest part, or in some respect, at least culturally, sort of the earliest part of what will absolutely explode by the end of 1965 and 1966 and culminate in 1966 with the launching of the Cultural Revolution. Because it's only after ghost plays are thoroughly trashed, it's only after Meng, Chao, and Huiniang have been thoroughly trashed that we actually see Jiang Qing and others turn their attention to more high profile and politically well-connected targets. So I think of the ghost play ban of 63 as, again, being this really important indicator that the cultural world is about to start moving and shifting rapidly. And indeed, it does. So by 1965, this is actually when we get the prelude to the Cultural Revolution. When we talk about the prelude, that's often been described as the attack on Wuhan and his Hairei at the end of 1965. And I say, no, we should really push this back to Meng Chao, because it's Meng Chao that comes under criticism first, and is going to become, again, one of these three great anti-party, anti-socialist thought poisonous weeds. I've got an edition of Li Huiniang, which you unfortunately can't really see, but it has the title crossed out, Li Huiniang, and above it says poisonous weed, and then below that it actually says material for criticism. But it was Meng Chao that was hung out to dry first. And I think it is important. And again, this is a sort of culmination of the ghost play debate. It's not just about ghosts. Now it becomes really sort of viciously political. So in November, we have the criticism of Hairei and Wuhan. And again, this is going to be described as sort of the prelude. And then the final sort of pièce de résistance is going to be the criticism of Tianhan and his Xie Yaohuan. But these three are linked indelibly together as one of my sort of interests in this. But I think it's also really important to note that Li Huiniang is not a ghost opera. Or Li Huiniang is a ghost opera. The other two are not ghost operas. So there is something special about the form, and there's something special about the form politically. Meng Chao is actually going to have a pretty miserable time during the Cultural Revolution. Ma Jianling is actually also going to be attacked in 1965. He winds up committing suicide. Meng Chao does manage to survive and survives being in a cowshed and being beaten up by Red Guards and stuff. And he survives until 1976. But the sort of tail end of my story is what happens to these ghost operas and their authors after 1976. And of course, they eventually get rehabilitated. But one thing that you see is when people are discussing the ghost play problem, just like in many other areas after the Cultural Revolution, after 1976, is a lot of anger and a lot of frustration on the part of the people who have survived this, for in particular people who haven't. Finally, and I'll just talk really briefly about this because we don't have too much time left. I end the epilogue by meditating, the book with an epilogue, sort of meditating on what lessons we might draw from the ways in which we saw party interest in and control of certain kinds of cultural production. And when I was living in Shanghai in 2011, in March of 2011, a directive came out that strongly discouraged all sorts of content, things that were superstitious and feudal and pornographic, including things like time travel stories. And the directive was really fascinating because if you'd just taken out the references to television, it could have come straight from 1963. I think that there's a lot to be learned from cultural production and cultural regulation in the high socialist period, because in a lot of the language and the impulse, we still see some really similar things today. I'm not trying to say that they're exactly equivalent, but it's not accidental that with a lot of these directives, you really could pick them up and put them back into 1963, and they would seem completely normal and at home there. You know, the party is still very much concerned with what people are consuming and how they're consuming it and what that looks like and what the implications are for both, you know, sort of party control of the state, but also, you know, what do they want people to get from this. So I have other things that I'm moving on to next, but as I always say to people, I can still feel a lot of the echoes of this project, even when I'm looking at stuff like video games and the regulation of video games today. So I think with that, I will pause there, if that's okay. Yes, no?
Yes, great.
Okay.
That was terrific, Maggie. Thank you so much. I wish we could have like some canned applause or something like that. That was really fantastic. And I've got a million questions. I don't want to pull rank yet. I am going to now unmute. No, rather, I'm going to allow participants to unmute themselves. I would like folks to jump into the chat first if you have a question, and I will see if. And I see some familiar names and faces there, Catherine and Dongman Kim, and also William Huber from UCSC.
Yeah.
Hey, William, great to see you there. And Maura and some other folks joining us. So I've also got some of my PRC students here who learned about Hai Rui last week. So flag that one. Remember Peng De Huai as Hai Rui. I've got a lot to discuss. We have about 15 minutes. We can go a little bit over the 1 o'clock hour. So before I pull rank here, please you can either jump in on the chat. You can chat, hit everybody with a chat, or I don't think it'll get too chaotic if folks want to unmute themselves. But if it does, then we'll try to get some kind of cue going on the chat. But if folks have questions, burning questions, please go ahead and unmute yourself. Thank you so much, Maggie. This was a really fantastic talk. Nice that we just hit the Cultural Revolution in my class.
This is Kathy.
Kathy, go ahead.
There's a raise your
Kathy.
hand function. I found it.
Hello.
Hello. I wanted to tell you how much I appreciated your perspective. And I hope that the book has as much of a sense of humor as you do in the presentation. I really appreciated sort of the joking nature of, you know, how the government is managing, in quotes, the material or handling the idea that people will believe in ghosts and somehow that's dangerous. That was very funny to me. So maybe you want to say a little more about that idea.
There actually is a fair amount of humor in the books. I mean, I suppose that some of this is me just having spent too much time with Marxist stuff. But in my first chapter, actually, I cover debates over the cowherd and the weaving maid. And there's just this sort of hysterical exchange between Ai Ting, who's Ai Weiwei's father, and another a playwright who had written this sort of crazy version of the cowherd and the weaving maid. And I think you can forget how funny some of these people can be, and it's funny in this sort of vicious kind of way, because you recognize that this has really sort of pretty serious political ramifications if you're criticizing people for a certain amount of things. But there is a lot of humor that does appear throughout the book. And I mean, sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's angry sarcasm, but a lot of these people were really, really well educated. They sound like they probably would have been pretty fun to hang out and drink some baijiu with and read some Chinese poetry together. But it's sort of woven through there. And at times, I think you can really feel the frustration of some of these intellectuals and cultural workers with what they see as sort of really silly stuff. I think I mentioned Zhang Zhen when he's writing that, if somebody believes in ghosts, like if they see ghosts on stage or not, it's not going to make any difference. Like they're still going to believe in ghosts. So that also I think tends to come through a lot. But I don't know, these were a bunch of really smart, really brilliant people, sometimes snarky as hell. And it makes for pretty good reading in some respects.
Thanks, I have a question. Maggie. Yeah, just a second, Hunter. I think I wanted to underline something quickly, and that was this. This is for our students, because we're talking. I have an early imperial class in the morning, and that was you noted this, and I just want to underline it. That thanks, Kathy. Kathy's in from our theater department, by the way. That idea of these are really elite intellectuals, but we're also dealing with a very earthy art form. This isn't Puccini. Right, so when we hear opera, sometimes that's kind of what we think of the golden binocular glasses and that kind of thing. This is a very different kind of an opera, and so for our Western students from Western theater background or any other, when we say opera, we're talking about this very earthy medium, and then these very elite intellectual authors, and it's a fascinating interaction there where you've got this sort of folk opera form, and there's so much to dig into there, of course, because of Mao's sort of performed folkiness, and he's, it's a lot to dig into. Hunter, please jump in.
Yeah, so could this thing about banning plays simply because they have ghosts, is that a cover for banning works that criticize the Mao and the state?
So Li Huiniang was never really read at the time, at least not openly, as being critical of the Great Leap Forward. You really don't start to see that line of criticism. It's very late, actually. It's late into 1965 that you see that. I think banning ghosts was a way for Jiang Qing to start setting some of the wheels in motion. Jiang Qing and the other people she's affiliated with to kind of start setting the wheels in motion for what winds up being pretty big, sweeping cultural change. Ghosts are an easy target. They're low-hanging fruit. And then when the criticism goes from just being like, well, ghost plays are bad because they encourage superstition, to the authors need to be attacked because they're promulgating anti-party, anti-socialist thinking, Meng Chao is again sort of low-hanging fruit because he's in a much less protected position than either Wuhan or Tianhan. So I don't think necessarily that it was Jiang Qing thinking like, oh, we're going to get rid of anything that criticizes the government. I think they could have done that in a lot of other ways if they'd wanted to, but it helped pave the way for what again turned out to be pretty sweeping cultural change between 63 and 65.
Thanks, Hunter. And others want to either jump in. As Kathy noted, there is a raise hand function. If anybody wants to jump in there, or yeah, you can sort of indicate that you want to jump in. I love this idea of this very specific topic distinguishing between the anti-rightist and Cultural Revolution persecutions. And you did that. It was very nice between the 57, 58 and then the early and mid 1960s, taking this very specific through line and saying, it isn't all the same. The persecutions look different in this time. It might have to do with it being prior to the Sino-Soviet split, the Sino-Soviet issues, where there's more kind of orthodoxy to the anti-rightist movement, and then it becomes just no holds barred, arbitrary, score settling, like you said, low-hanging fruit of the Cultural Revolution. That's such an important distinction to draw. But we've got a question from Kevin. What are some of the ways in which you are extrapolating these tensions within this Chinese opera art form into your current work on the more contemporary forms, such as comics and video games, which we tend to think of as being much more influenced by or disseminated in global capitalist context? That's a rich question.
Oh, yeah, that is, there's a lot. You'll have to wait for my second book to be written before I can. I'm really early into my second project, but I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is this tension. I don't know, video games are particularly interesting because I think coming from the West, often what people do is they look at these things, even if they're produced by, say, American studios, it's only when we're looking at games produced, say, in China or from Japanese companies that we're like, oh, there must be some deeper truth here. But I am really interested in thinking about the ways in which video games in particular, how those are getting regulated and what that looks like, because there's all these sort of complicated mechanisms where that you don't have when you're thinking about opera, right? It's very different to have World of Warcraft in China versus Huiniang. So there is more complex stuff going on, but even with video games, you still see some of the same tensions. So a couple of years ago, I read a study that had been done by the Wuhan Academy of Social Science asking whether or not young people today were more likely to believe in reincarnation because they play video games where there is no such thing as like permanent death. And I mean, they had like marshaled all this stuff to sort of look at this. So I think some of the tensions are actually still the same, but of course, then you've got different kinds of tensions also coming in on top of them because, as you point out, I mean, these are coming from a very different sort of place of production. So I think there's going to be more similarities between video game regulation and ghost opera than most people would probably assume. But I think thinking about some of this bureaucratic context in the 50s and 60s has been really helpful for me in how I'm going to approach stuff going forward with much more contemporary forms.
Excuse me?
Please, Hunter, again.
All right, so speaking of, you know, I've read in an article a few years ago that China banned time travel stories. So could you say that the stuff about banning stuff because of supernatural or science fiction elements is still happening?
So that was a directive that I mentioned that came out in March of 2011. And they didn't actually ban it per se, they just really strongly discouraged it. I personally think that a lot of this comes down to issues related to escapism. I know that must seem like a sort of kind of throwaway response onto why some of this stuff has been so powerful, but I think there's actually a lot of real similarities between these time travel stories, which often feature these young women who are kind of out of step with their own eras, who then get dumped back into the, you know, the Ming dynasty or the Qing dynasty or whatever. And these stories of young women who wind up in these horrible situations and die and then come back as ghosts. I sort of meditate towards the end on the appeal of these products for why were people so passionate about them in the 1950s and early 1960s. I think that a lot of it really was sort of escapism, at least in the sense of, you know, we have to write this stuff all day, every day, this sort of Marxist, very, you know, we have to sit here and worry about historical materialism and then wanting to escape into something different. I quote from the novel Dictionary of Matiao, where this sent down youth is trying to marshal this peasant into playing a role in an opera and plowing and field work, and the peasant basically says, you know, comrade, I have to deal with all this stuff every day in the fields, and now you want me to get on stage and sing about it. So I think that was actually one reason for the real appeal of things like Li Huiniang or Wandering Westlake. It was something that was so different, and I think the government is still concerned about people wanting to escape whatever their current reality is by submersing themselves in other kinds of products.
David has a question. Thank you, Hunter. Great questions. David has a question. What are your thoughts on the trend of American movie studios pandering to the Chinese government for access to their market? A little bit out of that's a.
It's really gross. It's
bigger question. Yeah.
But thanks capitalism. I mean, it's the sort of thing that it's not actually I think a big surprise, but it can be disappointing. Disappointing nonetheless. And of course, game companies kind of can run into some pretty similar things. You know, World of Warcraft, they banned representations of skeletons in Warcraft because that was like superstitious and bad. But it's okay for Chinese games to have skeletons. I guess if it's a Chinese skeleton versus a Western capitalist skeleton, this makes all the difference. Not surprising in our current environment, but yeah, just disappointing nonetheless.
Could be a deep dive on the skeletons topic. I heard somebody complain that that's the reason we don't have any great baseball movies anymore, because the mainland Chinese market is, I mean, Taiwan has plenty of baseball, Japan as well, but not mainland China.
That's funny.
If any mute themselves or jump into the chat, please go ahead. Otherwise, I will pull rank and start talking about the Cultural Revolution. I'm interested in the contrast between the Soviet model on what's going on in the Soviet Union here in terms of the earthiness of Soviet art as opposed to the kind of Soviet ballets versus Chinese operas and Soviet symphonic music and operas, whereas the earthier art forms need to be more heavily either regulated or banned in China because they have such a long tradition, and I'm not saying they don't in Russia, but they have such a long tradition of being really, really subversive in a lot of their messaging, and so there's a kind of allowance for the earthiness to be consumed by the elites because it's okay for them, and again Mao sort of projects himself in that way, but in terms of the earthy masses consuming their own earthy art, it needs to be much more processed through the sort of correct visions. Do you have any comparative stuff in there? Do you look at any different? Yeah,
so I do compare, in the introduction, I do talk a little bit about, you know, some of the similarities between in the Soviet Union and in repurposing and sort of repackaging ballet, which had literally just been the domain of elites, right? The woman who wrote a fantastic book called Swans of the Kremlin has these hilarious photographs of like these like workers like in the Mariinsky Theater looking very confused by, you know, all the gold leaf and stuff. But you know, opera is different. And opera is also really hard to control, right? Because how do you prove, so I didn't get into talking about this in this talk, but I talk about it in the book. In the early attempts at regulation, sort of mid-level cadres were kind of laying waste to entire repertoires. And what they started discovering is these opera troupes were desperate to be able to make a living. So they would start inserting parts of plays that they weren't supposed to be performing into plays that they were allowed to perform. So you would wind up with these like monstrosities of, you know, Qing Dynasty settings with Han Dynasty heroes and all this crazy stuff going on, but just because they were so desperate to control it. But that's one of the interesting things about opera versus say film or even thinking about, you know, published literature, right? Because how do you actually control what people are performing on stages, especially when you have so many troops spread throughout the entire country? So this is one reason, you know, the CCP was actually really concerned about drama reform, was because they recognized that on the one hand, well, we could do a lot with this art form, but on the other hand, like, oh, this could be really, really bad, you know, if the wrong messages are sort of being promulgated. So I didn't spend too much time meditating on some of the similarities, the cultural similarities between regulation in the Soviet Union and here. One thing I will say from the cultural histories I've read of the Soviet Union, a lot of the historians seem to be a little more inclined to believe that the people they're studying didn't actually believe in the promise of Marxism or socialism, whereas I do actually really believe that a lot of the people I look at, you know, the ones that really, they joined the party in 1924 and been members of the party until they were purged during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, and they fought and they suffered. they might not have believed in everything that happened after 1949, but I do think many of them really did believe in the promise of Marxism and did want to live up to these sort of socialist dictates on art and literature, and just found it really, really, really difficult to be able to do so.
This is such a rich talk. I really appreciate it, Maggie. We do have to wrap up soon. If anybody has a burning question, they want to either unmute themselves or weigh in quickly. Otherwise, we will wrap up. The talk is recorded. I will be posting it for our students, and we'll go through a few processes on that. But I think that's it. I don't think we have any parting shots from our gathering folks. This is such a rich talk, Maggie. The book is in the mail. It's on its way to me.
I'll be curious to hear what you think. I said it's nice. It's short. It's nice and short. So
it's fascinating. Oh, hi Dongman. You can unmute there if you'd like. And thanks so much for joining us. It's really been a rich talk. And it reminds me of the sort of hodgepodge aspect of Darth Vader and the Triceratops. So if anybody really wants to check out the rest of Professor Greene's canon, you can see a fantastic.
Yeah, I'm gonna forever. It's gonna be my most famous product ever. That's how I just get introduced now at conferences.
Darth Vader and the Triceratops. You can't miss.
Can't
with
make
that.
this stuff. Yeah, you can't.
I need to know more.
Well, thank you so much. This is delightful. So
thank you.
I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks everybody for joining us. Hi Dongman. Thanks guys. Thank you so much, Professor Greene. And I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Absolutely. Everyone have a really wonderful Tuesday.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.